The trade no one expected. The bar was loud, filled with shouts, music, and the clinking of glasses. It sat on the far edge of the mining colony, a place where rules were loose and trouble was easy to find. Jack sat at a corner table, his drink untouched, his eyes scanning the room. He had just finished a long shift in the mines and came here only to rest his legs, not to join the noise. Then the door swung open, and the mood shifted for a moment. A large alien stumbled inside, his eyes red, his steps uneven. He smelled of strong liquor, even from across the room. In his rough hands, he dragged two small figures, both no taller than his waist. They were children, alien children, thin and frightened, their wrists bound with a frayed cord. Jack's eyes narrowed. He had seen many ugly things in his life, but this felt different. The drunk alien shoved the children forward, almost making them fall. "Drink," he slurred to the bartender. "1 glass. Strongest you got. These two will cover it." The bartender raised an eyebrow, but didn't look surprised. This was the kind of place where people traded anything, tools, weapons, even lives. A few in the bar laughed. Others turned away. No one spoke against it. The children stood close together, trembling, their eyes darting around the room. Jack could see their skin was marked with strange symbols, burned into them like brands. His jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. Ownership. These kids belonged to someone before, and that someone had not been kind. The bartender shrugged and reached for a bottle. "Strongest we got," he said, pouring the drink. The drunk alien grinned, thinking he had made a fair trade. Jack's hands curled into fists under the table. He didn't plan to get involved, not at first, but something inside him pushed. Harder than his caution, he stood up, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Wait," Jack said, his voice calm, but sharp enough to cut through the laughter. All eyes turned to him. The drunk alien frowned, his words slow. "What?" Jack walked closer, his gaze never leaving the children. "They're not worth a drink," Jack said. "They're worth more than that," the alien sneered. "What's it to you, human? You want them? Then pay." Jack reached into his pocket and placed a handful of mining credits on the counter. It was enough to buy several bottles. The bartender's eyebrows rose slightly. The drunk alien looked at the credits, then at Jack. A slow, greedy smile spread on his face. "Deal," he said, shoving the children toward Jack like they were sacks of grain. The children stumbled into Jack's legs, one of them catching herself. Before she fell, they looked up at him with wide, unsure eyes. Jack placed a hand gently on their shoulders, guiding them toward the door. The drunk alien grabbed his drink and lifted it high, laughing loudly as the bar noise returned to normal. To everyone else, the deal was just another strange trade in a lawless place. But for Jack, it felt like the start of something he couldn't name yet. Outside, the air was cold and thin. The children shivered, their bare feet silent on the dusty street. Jack knelt down to meet their eyes. "It's all right," he said softly. Even though they didn't understand his language, they only stared at him, breathing quickly. Jack knew they were scared, not just of him, but of everything. He stood and led them toward the small living quarters he kept near the mine. The walk was quiet, except for the distant hum of machinery. Jack kept glancing down at the two figures walking beside him. They moved like shadows, staying close to each other. One of them, the smaller child, looked no older than 6 by human years. The other, perhaps 8 or 9, had sharper eyes, as if she'd learned too young how to watch for danger. When they reached his door, Jack tapped the access panel. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small, cluttered room. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a pile of mining gear filled most of the space. He motioned for the children to come inside. They stepped in cautiously, their eyes scanning every corner. Jack closed the door behind them, sealing out the colony noise. From a cupboard, Jack pulled out some ration packs. He tore one open and set it on the table. The smell of warm bread and stew filled the room. At first, the children didn't move. Then the older one gave a small nod to the younger. They stepped forward and began to eat, their small hands trembling. Jack watched them, realizing just how hungry they must have been. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was quiet eating. Jack leaned back in his chair, still unsure what he had just stepped into. He didn't know who these children were, where they came from, or why they had been sold. But one thing was certain. Whatever had happened to them before, it wasn't going to happen again, not while they were with him. Jack sat on the edge of his bed, watching the two alien children from across the small room. They were huddled together on the floor, still close to the door, as if ready to run, even though he had brought them here, even though he had given them food. They didn't trust him yet. Jack couldn't blame them. Trust didn't come easy when life had already taught you fear. The older child, a girl, had pale silvery skin that caught the light in strange ways. Her eyes were bright amber, glowing faintly, the kind of eyes that could spot danger in a crowd. The younger one, a boy, had darker skin with faint blue lines running along his arms, markings that pulsed softly. Jack wondered if it was natural, or another cruel sign left by whoever had owned them. He moved slowly, not wanting to scare them. Opening a small storage box, he pulled out a blanket and set it on the floor near them. "You'll be warmer with this," he said gently. They stared at the blanket, then at him. The boy looked like he wanted to take it, but didn't dare. The girl pulled it toward them after a moment, wrapping it around both their shoulders. Jack saw the tiniest flicker of relief in her eyes. He leaned back and tried to figure out what to do next. He had no plan. All he knew was that he couldn't send them back. And he couldn't let the wrong people find them. But here, in this mining colony, everything had eyes and ears. The syndicate, the gangs, the people who traded in lives. Word would spread, and when it did, trouble would come knocking. Jack got up and went to the small counter in the corner to prepare more food. This time he cooked something warm, a pot of thick soup from what he had left. The smell filled the room, and he noticed the boy's eyes follow every move he made. When it was ready, Jack poured it into 2 bowls and placed them on the table. He stepped back, giving them space. The girl hesitated, then helped the boy to the table. They ate slowly at first, then faster, as if afraid the food might vanish. Jack couldn't help but smile a little. When they were done, Jack tried again to speak to them. "I'm Jack," he said, pointing to himself. The boy tilted his head, not understanding. Jack repeated, "Jack," slowly. The girl studied him for a moment, then whispered something to the boy in their own language. Neither repeated his name, but at least they were listening. That night, Jack gave them his bed and took the floor. The mattress was narrow, but the children stayed pressed together on one side. Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could hear them whispering softly in their language. Every now and then, he caught one word, "hunters." It was said with fear, the kind of fear that sits in the bones. Jack knew enough about this part of space to understand what it meant. Hunters were syndicate enforcers. Once they marked someone, they didn't stop until the job was done, in the middle of the night. Jack woke to the sound of quiet sobbing. It was the boy, curled up against his sister. Jack sat up, unsure if he should go to them. The girl met his eyes in the dim light, her face tense. Jack nodded once, slowly, to show he wasn't a threat, then lay back down. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of something. Morning came with the sound of colony machinery starting up outside. Jack rose, made some tea, and watched the 2 children still wrapped in the blanket. He didn't know how long they had been without safety, but now they were here, and he would find a way to keep them here. Later, Jack took them into the main part of the colony. They kept close to him, their eyes wide as they passed busy market stalls. Vendors shouted, selling food, tools, and strange glowing crystals. The boy's attention locked on a display of bright red fruit. Jack bought 2 and handed them over. The boy hesitated, then bit into it. Juice dripped down his chin, and for the first time, Jack saw him smile, but not everyone in the market smiled back. A merchant eyed the children and frowned. He pulled Jack aside and whispered, "You know those markings? They're not decoration, they're syndicate brands." Jack's stomach tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it real. The merchant leaned in closer. "You're lucky they haven't come yet. When they do, they won't ask nicely." Jack thanked him and led the children back quickly. Once inside his quarters, he locked the door and sat heavily in his chair. It was clear now the syndicate would come, and when they did, he'd have to choose: hide, fight, or run. As the children curled up under the blanket again, Jack made a silent promise. No matter what happened, he wouldn't let them be taken. The market was busier than usual. Rows of stalls lined the main street of the mining colony, each packed with goods from across the galaxy. Spices that stung the nose, glowing minerals fresh from the mines, and tools built to last a lifetime. Jack moved carefully through the crowd, the two alien children staying close to his side. The girl's eyes darted left and right, always watching. The boy kept his small hand gripping Jack's coat, not wanting to lose him. The noise was overwhelming. Traders shouted over one another, customers bargained loudly, and the smell of cooked food filled the air. For a moment, Jack hoped the market's chaos would hide them, but in a place like this, nothing stayed hidden for long. Jack stopped at a food stall to buy some dried rations. The merchant handed over the package and leaned forward slightly. "You've got company," he said quietly. Jack's brows pulled together. "What do you mean?" The merchant nodded toward a cluster of figures on the far side of the street. They wore long coats, hoods pulled low, their faces hard to see, but Jack recognized the posture: alert, predatory, scanning the crowd. Hunters. He kept his expression calm, not wanting to alarm the children. "Let's move," he said softly, guiding them deeper into the market. The girl glanced up at him, sensing the change in his tone. They passed through rows of stalls, turning corners until the hooded figures were out of sight, or so Jack thought. At a small stand selling fresh bread, Jack bought a loaf and handed it to the children. The boy tore off a piece eagerly, while the girl ate slowly, her eyes still scanning for danger. A woman behind the stand leaned in close to Jack. "You should be careful," she whispered. Word spreading about a human who bought 2 syndicate-marked kids in the bar last night. Jack's gut tightened. So it had already begun. The gossip, the rumors, the attention, and in the colony. Attention could be deadly. The woman's voice dropped lower. "They'll come for them. And for you." Jack didn't answer, just nodded and moved on. The children followed without a word. The boy's small steps quickened, as if he understood they were in danger. Even if he didn't know why, they passed another stall where an old alien craftsman was selling hand-carved figures. The girl slowed, staring at a small wooden bird with outstretched wings. Jack paused beside her. "Do you like it?" he asked. She didn't answer, but her eyes stayed on the carving. The craftsman looked up, his gaze moving from the girl to the brands on her arm. He frowned, shaking his head. "You shouldn't be here with them," he muttered. Jack's patience was wearing thin. "Why?" he asked, his tone sharper than before. The craftsman sighed. "Because people are watching, and the syndicate doesn't forgive." Jack guided the children away again, his thoughts racing. Everywhere they went, the whispers followed. It was like the whole market had become a web, and every glance, every murmur, was a thread leading back to them. The girl seemed to sense it too, staying even closer to him. The boy's earlier smile from eating bread was gone, replaced by the same wary expression he'd had when Jack first saw him. As they neared the far end of the market, Jack caught sight of one of the hooded figures again. This time, the man's gaze was fixed on the children. Jack didn't break stride, but his grip on the boy's shoulder tightened. They turned down a side alley between 2 storage buildings, the sound of the market fading behind them. Once they were out of sight, Jack crouched down. He looked the children in the eyes, speaking slowly so they could understand, at least his tone. "Stay close to me. no matter what. The girl gave a small nod, her hand resting protectively on the boy's arm. Jack stood and led them back toward his quarters, taking the long way around to avoid the main street. When they finally reached home, Jack locked the door and pulled the blinds closed. He could still hear faint voices outside, the low hum of colony life carrying on. But inside, the air felt tense, heavy. The girl sat on the bed, holding the small piece of bread she hadn't finished. The boy curled under the blanket, silent now. Jack paced the small space, running through his options. The syndicate knew, or they would soon. Staying here much longer would mean waiting for them to knock, and they wouldn't knock politely. Jack looked at the two children, at the quiet fear in their eyes. He had made a choice in that bar without thinking about the cost. Now the cost was clear, and if he didn't move fast, he might lose them, outside, somewhere in the market. The hunters would still be searching, and every whisper, every sideways glance, would point them closer to his door. Jack knew what the next step had to be, but it would be dangerous. Very dangerous. Night settled over the mining colony. The market's noise faded into the low hum of generators and the occasional distant clang of machinery. Jack sat in the dim light of his quarters, his old rifle across his knees. The two children were curled up on his bed, wrapped tightly in the blanket he had given them. They had fallen asleep, but their rest was restless. The girl twitched at small noises. The boy whimpered quietly now and then. Jack's eyes stayed on the door. He had locked it, sealed the windows, and kept the lights low. But he knew locks and shadows wouldn't stop the syndicate if they decided to come tonight. The word hunters kept echoing in his head. The children had whispered it before, and now, as the hours dragged on, Jack could almost feel the hunters drawing closer. Somewhere in the colony, footsteps echoed slow, deliberate. They didn't belong to the usual late-night workers. Jack rose quietly, moving to the window, peering through the narrow gap in the blinds. He saw two figures walking side by side, long coats, hoods pulled low. Just like in the market, they weren't looking around like ordinary passersby. Their heads turned toward each doorway they passed, scanning, searching. Jack's hand tightened on the rifle. He stepped back from the window, his mind racing. They were here, maybe not at his door yet, but close enough that it was only a matter of time. A faint sound made him freeze. The children stirred as the floor outside creaked under slow, heavy steps. The shadow of boots moved across the thin line of light under his door. Jack positioned himself quietly between the door and the bed, his voice low but steady. "Stay quiet," he whispered to the children. The girl pulled the boy closer, her eyes locked on Jack. The boy buried his face against her arm. Then came a knock, not loud, not rushed, but firm, the kind of knock that said, "We know you're in there." Jack stayed silent. Another knock, slower this time. Then a voice, calm and deep, human. "We know you have what belongs to us." Jack's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. The voice continued, "Give them to us, and no harm will come to you." Jack almost laughed at the lie. He had seen the syndicate's work before. No harm wasn't in their vocabulary. The knock turned into a fist pounding the door. "Open it, or we come in," the voice growled. Jack raised the rifle and took a deep breath. The pounding stopped, replaced by footsteps moving away. He waited, listening. Then came the sound of metal scratching at the lock. They were trying to break in. Jack moved quickly to the door, pressing his shoulder against it as the lock rattled. The children stayed silent, though their fear filled the air like a heavy weight. After a few seconds, the scratching stopped. Then silence. Jack waited, every muscle tense. Finally, the footsteps faded into the distance. He didn't relax. He knew they weren't gone for good. They were testing him, letting him know they could come any time. The rest of the night dragged on. Jack sat near the door, rifle in hand, until the faint blue light of morning crept in. The children woke, their faces pale and tired. Jack made a small breakfast, though none of them ate much. The girl watched him closely, as if trying to read his thoughts. He didn't say anything, but she seemed to understand that danger was far from over. By midday, the colony streets were busy again, but Jack noticed more strangers now, standing at corners, watching. Some were syndicate muscle, others were paid eyes, informants who would trade a name for a handful of credits. The web was closing in. Jack knew the next knock wouldn't be a warning. It would be the end, unless he moved first. That evening, he made his decision. He sat down in front of the children and spoke slowly, pointing at himself. "Jack," he said, then pointed to them. The girl hesitated, then spoke a word, a name, quiet but clear. She pointed to the boy and said another name. Jack repeated them, carefully. It wasn't much, but it was a bond. Then he said, "We leave. Tonight." The girl tilted her head, but she didn't argue. She just tightened her hold on the boy's hand. As the colony's night cycle began again, Jack packed what little food and supplies he had. He checked the rifle, loaded it, and slung it over his shoulder. When the children were ready, he opened the back door quietly. The cold air bit at their faces. The streets behind the housing blocks were empty for now. Jack led them into the shadows, staying close to the walls. Every step away from his quarters felt like stepping deeper into danger, but there was no choice now. If they stayed, the syndicate's shadow would fall on them completely, and Jack wasn't going to let that happen. The colony's night cycle had barely begun when Jack led the children through the narrow back alleys. The air was cold and dry, carrying the faint hum of the mining machines in the distance. The streets here were darker, lit only by flickering wall lamps that buzzed softly. Jack moved quickly, but kept his steps quiet, glancing over his shoulder often. The girl stayed close to his left side, the boy to his right, both gripping the edges of his coat. They passed behind the row of storage buildings, the smell of fuel heavy in the air. Jack's plan was simple. Reach Dock 12 before the syndicate realized they were gone. An old friend of his, a pilot named Rourke, owed him a favor. If anyone could get them off this rock without drawing too much attention, it was Rourke. But favors in the outer colonies were never free, and Jack had nothing to offer except his word. He hoped that would be enough. Halfway to the docks, they heard voices, not close, but not far enough to ignore. Jack ducked into a narrow side passage, pressing the children against the wall. Two syndicate enforcers walked by the opening, their boots heavy on the metal floor. They were talking about the human and the two runts. Jack's jaw tightened. They were already searching. When the enforcers' voices faded, Jack led the children out again. His heart was pounding, but his steps didn't slow. Every shadow felt like a pair of watching eyes. Every sound made the girl glance over her shoulder. Finally, the faint glow of the docking area lights came into view. The docks were quieter at night, but still busy with cargo crews and small freighters, preparing for departure. Jack spotted a familiar shape, Rourke's old freighter, patched together with mismatched panels of metal. It wasn't pretty, but it could fly, and that was all that mattered. They crossed the open space quickly, keeping their heads down. When they reached the freighter, Jack knocked twice on the side hatch. A moment later, the hatch slid open, revealing Rourke, tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard streaked in gray. "Jack," Rourke said, eyes narrowing, "what trouble have you dragged to my door this time?" Jack glanced at the children, then back at him, the kind that doesn't go away if you ignore it. Rourke looked at the kids, his expression shifting. "They're syndicate marked," he muttered. "You're either the bravest man I know, or the stupidest. Maybe both," Jack said. Rourke sighed, then stepped aside. "Get in, before anyone sees you." Inside the freighter, the air smelled faintly of oil and old leather. Rourke led them to a small storage room near the back. "Stay here," he told the children. "Don't make a sound." They nodded silently, the girl pulling the boy close. Jack followed Rourke to the cockpit. "You know they'll be watching the main routes," Rourke said, settling into the pilot's chair. "I know," Jack replied. "That's why we're taking the ice run." Rourke turned to stare at him. "The ice run? That's suicide." "It's the only route they won't expect," Jack said. Rourke grumbled something under his breath, but began powering up the engines. Through the cockpit window, Jack saw two figures moving quickly along the far side of the dock. Even at this distance, he recognized the long coats. The way they scanned every ship. "They're here," Jack said sharply. Rourke's hands flew over the controls. "Strap in." Then, the freighter's engines roared to life. Dock workers turned to look, a few shouting as the ship lifted off earlier than scheduled. As they rose into the night sky, Jack saw the syndicate enforcers break into a run, heading for a small shuttle. "They're going to follow," Jack muttered. Rourke smirked. "Let them try." The freighter shot forward, leaving the colony lights behind. Stars filled the black sky, cold and endless, but Jack didn't relax. The syndicate's reach went far beyond one mining colony. The ice run was a dangerous shortcut through a drifting field of frozen asteroids. Most pilots avoided it because one wrong move could shatter a ship. Jack was counting on that danger to keep their pursuers at bay. In the storage room, the children sat close together, the hum of the ship's engines surrounding them. The boys' eyes were wide, the girl's hands tight on his shoulders. Jack came in and crouched down. "We're leaving the bad place," he said slowly, hoping they understood. The girl nodded slightly, though her expression stayed guarded. Back in the cockpit, Rourke guided the ship toward the glimmering field of ice. The asteroids reflected light from a nearby star, making them look like giant shards of glass floating in space. "They're still on us," Rourke said, checking the scanner. A small blip showed the syndicate shuttle closing in. Jack gritted his teeth. "Then take us in deeper." The freighter weaved between spinning ice boulders, the hull creaking as frozen shards scraped against it. Rourke cursed under his breath, steering hard to avoid a massive chunk that tumbled across their path. Jack glanced at the scanner again. The syndicate shuttle was still there, but farther back now. The ice run was slowing them down, just as Jack had hoped. After what felt like hours, they finally broke free of the densest part of the ice field. The scanner showed nothing behind them. Rourke leaned back in his seat, exhaling. "Looks like we lost them." Jack didn't smile. He knew the syndicate didn't give up that easily, but for now, they had a head start, and that was enough. In the storage room, the children looked up when Jack entered. "We're safe for now," he said quietly. The girl didn't speak, but for the first time, her shoulders seemed to relax. Jack sat down beside them, feeling the weight of what was still ahead. They were far from out of danger, but at least tonight, they were free. The freighter touched down on soft ground instead of metal. For the first time in many days, the air outside smelled fresh. Jack stepped down the ramp with the children, feeling the breeze brush against his face. They had landed on a remote farming settlement far beyond syndicate patrol routes. Rourke had sworn it was the kind of place where no one asked questions and no one cared who you were. The land stretched wide and green, dotted with simple houses and endless fields. Tall crops swayed gently in the wind, their leaves making a soft whispering sound. To the children, it was a sight they had never seen before. The boy's mouth opened slightly, his eyes darting from the sky to the ground. The girl's usual sharp gaze softened as she took in the horizon. There were no tall colony walls here, no crowded streets, and no cold metal floors under their feet. Jack led them toward the home of an old friend of Rourke's, a farmer named Ellis. Ellis was a broad man with sun-browned skin, calloused hands, and a voice like gravel. When Rourke explained who Jack had brought, Ellis only nodded. "You'll work, you'll eat, and you'll keep to yourselves," he said. "That's how we do things here," Jack agreed instantly. All he needed was a place to keep the children safe. The first night on the farm was quiet. The children shared a small room with 2 beds pushed against the wall. Jack slept in a corner of the main room, his back against the wall and his rifle within reach. Even though the settlement seemed peaceful, old habits wouldn't let him rest easily. But sometime in the night, he heard something he hadn't before. Laughter. It was soft and short, but real. The boy had laughed in his sleep. Over the next few days, Jack worked the fields alongside Ellis. The children stayed close at first, watching from the edge of the crops. Eventually, Ellis's wife, Mara, coaxed them into helping with small tasks, gathering vegetables, carrying baskets. The boy would smile when Mara gave him small sweets as thanks. The girl never smiled openly, but Jack noticed her eyes lingering on the animals in the pasture. A young farm dog followed her everywhere, and though she never reached to touch it, she never pushed it away either. Jack began teaching them simple human words in the evenings, pointing to objects around the room, chair, table, light, and having them repeat. The boy learned quickly, his voice small but eager. The girl spoke less, but her understanding grew fast. Sometimes, Jack caught them whispering to each other in their own language, followed by a shared glance toward him. He didn't know what they were saying, but he didn't need to. He could see they were beginning to trust him. But even in this quiet place, danger still had long shadows. One afternoon, while Jack was repairing a fence, Ellis walked over with a serious look. "Had some traders pass through this morning," he said. "They mentioned seeing a ship like yours in the ice run." Jack's grip on the fence tightened. "Did they mention me?" Ellis shook his head. "No, but if they're talking about it, it means words still moving." Jack nodded, knowing what that meant. The syndicate hadn't stopped looking. That night, Jack sat by the small fire outside the farmhouse. The children joined him, the boy leaning against his arm. The girl sat quietly, watching the flames. "You're safe here," Jack said softly, though part of him wondered if it was true. The girl looked up at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It wasn't a full smile, but it was close. The days turned into a rhythm. Mornings in the fields, afternoons helping around the house, evenings learning words and sharing meals. The children began to look healthier, their cheeks less hollow, their steps lighter. Jack started to believe they might actually have a future here. Then, one evening, while Jack was returning from the fields, he saw something that froze him in place. At the far end of the dirt road, a stranger stood. He wasn't dressed like a farmer. His coat was dark, his posture too straight, his eyes scanning the fields slowly. When the man's gaze turned toward the farmhouse, Jack knew instantly he was looking for something, or someone. Jack didn't approach him. Instead, he took the long way back, slipping through the edges of the field to avoid being seen. Inside the farmhouse, he told Ellis quietly. Ellis's expression hardened. "You think it's them?" Jack nodded. Ellis spat into the dirt. "Then we'll be ready." That night, Jack sat by the window with a rifle across his lap. The children slept in their room, unaware of the new shadow moving closer. Jack stared out into the dark fields, the peaceful whisper of crops now carrying a hint of threat. They had found safety here, but he knew it might not last. And if the syndicate had finally tracked them this far, there would be no more running. Next time, he would have to stand his ground. The morning was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual calls from the farm animals seemed softer, the breeze lighter. Jack stepped out of the farmhouse and scanned the fields. Nothing moved except the crops swaying gently, but he knew the stillness wasn't peace. It was the calm before a storm. Ellis came up beside him, holding a shotgun. "They'll come today," he said, voice steady but grim. Jack nodded. "We'll make sure they don't take them." They had spoken little the night before, but both men understood what had to be done. This wasn't a city where the syndicate could walk in and take what they wanted without a fight. Here, neighbors stood for each other. The girl appeared in the doorway, the boy peeking out from behind her. Jack crouched down, meeting their eyes. "Stay inside," he said gently, pointing toward the back of the house. The girl studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod, taking the boy's hand. Jack watched them disappear inside before standing again. By midday, the dirt road leading to the farm shimmered in the heat. A dark shape appeared in the distance, growing larger with each passing minute. It was a black transport, dust swirling in its wake. Jack's jaw tightened. The syndicate didn't send subtle messages. They came in full view to remind everyone they were feared. The transport rolled to a stop just beyond the front gate. 3 figures stepped out, all in long coats. Their faces shadowed. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward. "You have something that belongs to us," he said, his voice calm but sharp. Jack stayed silent, gripping the rifle in his hands. The man smiled faintly, hand over the children. "And we'll let you keep your life." Before Jack could answer, the sound of footsteps came from behind him. It was Ellis, Mara, and 3 more farmers from neighboring plots. Each held a weapon, old but ready. "This is our land," Ellis said, his voice carrying across the yard. "And those kids aren't yours." The syndicate man's smile faded, replaced by cold calculation. "You think you can stand against us?" he asked. Ellis spat in the dirt. "We don't think we know." The standoff stretched, the summer heat pressing down like a weight. Jack kept his rifle steady, his heart pounding. He wasn't just fighting for himself now, he was fighting for the boy and the girl who had been sold like objects. He was fighting for the chance to give them something no one else had, a home. The syndicate man raised his hand, and the 2 others moved forward, before they could take another step. A loud crack split the air, a warning shot from Ellis's shotgun. The message was clear. The next shot wouldn't be in the dirt. The 2 enforcers froze, glancing at their leader. The man studied the group in front of him, the way they stood firm, the way the rifles didn't waver. Finally, he lowered his hand. "This isn't over," he said coldly, turning back toward the transport. The 3 climbed in, the engine roared, and the vehicle rolled back down the road, dust trailing behind. Only when the sound faded completely did Jack lower his rifle. The other farmers began to relax. Though no one fully smiled yet, Ellis clapped Jack on the shoulder. "They won't risk coming back. Not here." Jack wasn't so sure, but for now, he let the words stand. Inside the farmhouse, the children were waiting near the back door. When Jack stepped in, the boy ran to him and wrapped his small arms around his leg. The girl stood a little apart, her expression unreadable. Jack crouched down, looking at her. "You're safe," he said softly. She stared at him for a long moment, then whispered in careful broken human speech, "We home now." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. He smiled, not the small, guarded smile he had worn for weeks, but something real. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "You're home." The days after passed quietly. Life on the farm returned to its steady rhythm. The boys' laughter came more often now, ringing across the fields. The girl began to smile, though only when she thought no one was looking. Jack worked the land with Ellis, taught the children new words in the evenings, and listened to the wind in the crops at night. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the 3 of them sat together on the farmhouse porch. The boy leaned against Jack's side, the girl sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. The sky was painted in shades of gold and red. Jack looked out over the fields and knew the truth. He hadn't just saved them, they had saved him too.